In the spring of 1462, the largest army in Europe marched out of Constantinople to crush a country it expected to conquer in a single summer. Somewhere between 60 and 90,000 men, Janissaries cavalry, siege engineers, artillery, a logistics train stretching for miles. At its head rode the man who 9 years earlier had done what everyone said was impossible: breach the walls of Constantinople and end the Byzantine Empire. Mehmed the Conqueror. 30 years old, still the most feared soldier alive. The target was Wallachia, a minor principality on the northern bank of the Danube, forested, poor, and ruled by a prince most European courts could not have named without checking. On paper, the campaign should have taken a summer: cross the river, take the capital, install a compliant ruler, and march home before the harvest. That is not what happened. Somewhere on that road, the largest army in Europe would break. Not in a pitched battle, there was not one worth remembering. Not against a superior force, there was not one. The Sultan's expedition would collapse from something older and stranger than defeat on a battlefield. It would collapse from fear. The prince who inflicted that fear became one of the most misunderstood figures in European history. Popular culture knows him as Dracula. A 19th century Irish novelist dressed him in a cape. 20th century film gave him fangs. All of that came later, invented in the 1890s by a writer who had never been to Wallachia and was borrowing a name he found in a library. Strip the vampire away, and what remains is a question soldiers' kings, and historians have argued about for 500 years. How does a weak state stop a superpower? What weapon does a small country use when a direct battle is suicide? The answer this prince found in the summer of 1462 was so extreme, so theatrical, and so deliberate that even his enemies stopped to describe it. To understand what happened, we have to go back 20 years to a spring day when 2 boys were handed over as hostages. Wallachia in 1442 was a small country wedged between 2 giants. To the south, across the Danube River, sat the Ottoman Empire, then the most aggressive expansionist power on earth. To the north, past the Carpathian Mountains, lay the Kingdom of Hungary, still the largest Catholic power east of Vienna. Between them, on a patchwork of forests, marshes, and poor farmland, ruled Vlad II. Sometimes for Hungary, sometimes for the Sultan, always trying to keep his throne without fully choosing a side. That balancing act had a price. To prove his loyalty to the Ottoman court, Vlad II handed over 2 of his sons. In the diplomatic language of the century, it was called hostage-taking. In practice, it meant his boys would be raised at the Sultan's palace, educated at his expense, and, if their father ever betrayed him, quietly killed. The boys were 11 and 7. The older one was Vlad III. The younger was called Radu. For the next 6 years, they lived inside the machinery of the Ottoman state. They learned Turkish and Arabic. They learned Islamic law. They watched military drills, sat in on council sessions, and this matters later witnessed executions. Impalement, the punishment that would later make Vlad infamous, was not something he invented. He learned it there in the Sultan's provinces, as a specific and highly public method of putting political enemies to death. The 2 brothers responded very differently. Radu the younger adapted. He learned the language easily, converted to Islam in his teens, and moved comfortably in the world of the Ottoman princes. Court records suggest he became close to a boy roughly his own age, the future Sultan Mehmed II. That friendship would matter 20 years later, when the 2 men found themselves on opposite sides of a war for Wallachia. Vlad did not adapt. He learned everything: the tactics, the languages, the etiquette. But he did not soften. What he seems to have taken from those years was more useful than gratitude. He learned exactly how the Ottoman army worked. He learned how its command decisions were made, where its weaknesses were, and what its soldiers feared. He learned, in other words, how to fight them. In November of 1447, the game outside caught up with the boys. Their father, still trying to play both sides, was killed by his own nobles in a coup, partly encouraged by Hungary. Their older brother was buried alive during the same purge. The throne of Wallachia was suddenly open, and the Sultan, for reasons of his own, decided the older hostage was useful. In 1448, at the age of 17, Vlad III was sent north with a small Ottoman force to claim his father's crown. He held it for 2 months before Hungarian-backed rivals pushed him out. He would spend the next 8 years wandering through Moldavia and Transylvania, learning how a young man without an army survives in a region where every court had already tried to kill his family. Then the world changed. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed II, Vlad's childhood companion, roughly the same age, did what centuries of Muslim armies had failed to do. Ottoman gunpowder brought down the triple walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, 1,000 years old, ended in an afternoon. For Wallachia, this was not distant news. Every Christian state on the Danube frontier now understood something that had been theoretical the week before. Ottoman expansion was not going to stop, and walls were not going to slow it. The empire had just consumed the greatest fortified city in Christendom. There was no natural barrier left between Mehmed's armies and Central Europe. Only a handful of small Balkan states, with Wallachia caught in the middle. By 1456, after nearly a decade of exile and shifting alliances, Vlad III had recovered his father's throne, this time with Hungarian help. He was 25 years old, and the country he inherited was, from a military point of view, a disaster. Wallachia had a structural problem, and it had nothing to do with the Turks. Power in the principality theoretically belonged to the prince. In practice, it belonged to a class of aristocratic landowners called boyars. The boyars owned the farms. They ran the local administration. They controlled the peasant militias. And this was the important part. They chose the prince. Or when they grew tired of one, they killed him. In the 50 years before Vlad took the throne in 1456, Wallachia had cycled through more than a dozen princes. His grandfather had been assassinated. His father had been assassinated. His brother had been buried alive. This was the country's default political mechanism. If you did not control the boyars controlled you. Eventually, they killed you. Vlad's answer to this problem is where his reputation begins. He did not negotiate. He did not build coalitions. Very early in his reign, the exact year is debated, though most historians place it within the first 2 years. He invited the senior boyar class to an Easter feast at his court in Târgoviște. According to Ottoman and Wallachian chronicles, the older nobles at the feast were impaled. The younger and healthier ones were marched into the mountains in their court clothes and put to work rebuilding an abandoned fortress. Most of them died from exhaustion. This story sits at the center of the mythology that would grow around Vlad. It needs to be understood carefully because it explains almost everything that came next. Impalement was not a Wallachian invention, and in this century it was not unusual. It was a standard capital punishment in the Ottoman Empire, in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, and across the Balkans. The historian Nicolae Stoicescu, who wrote the classic modern study of Vlad, is direct about this. Vlad's cruelty was not the personal pathology of a madman. It was the ordinary punishment of his region, applied at extraordinary scale. He was not inventing sadism. He was industrializing law. The purpose was centralization. The boyars had killed his father and his brother. They would kill him too if they could. Vlad's answer was to make the price of disloyalty so visible and so grotesque that no one would test it. Within a few years of taking the throne, he had built something no Wallachian prince had ever possessed, a state that answered to him alone. That mattered because in 1459, he was going to do something no Wallachian prince had ever done. Every year, the Prince of Wallachia paid tribute to the Sultan. The technical term was jizya. In principle, it was a tax paid by non-Muslim subjects for the right to keep their faith. In practice for Wallachia, it meant 10,000 gold ducats and 500 boys, young Wallachian boys, drafted into the Ottoman military system, most of them destined for the Janissary Corps. They would never see home again. Vlad had paid this tribute for the first 3 years of his reign. In 1459, he stopped. There is no surviving letter announcing the refusal. The sources record only what happened next. The tribute did not arrive in Constantinople, and Vlad sent no apology. For Mehmed, that was a message even a rival prince 1,000 miles away could understand. A vassal who did not pay was not a vassal. He was a rebel. Once the tribute stopped, there was no going back. In Constantinople, The machinery of Ottoman diplomacy would spend the next 2 years trying to solve the Wallachian problem quietly, without a full campaign. Mehmed had larger plans farther west. He did not want a war on his northern border, so he would try twice to remove Vlad without one. The first attempt would fail. The second would go so badly that, within a year, the largest army in Europe would be marching toward the Danube. The first attempt was diplomatic, and it was a trap. In the winter of 1461, Mehmed sent an envoy across the Danube into Wallachia. His name was Hamza Bey, a senior Ottoman official and governor of the Nicopolis frontier region. His official mission was straightforward: escort Vlad to a border meeting where the tribute dispute could be resolved face to face. His real mission was to kidnap him. Traveling with Hamza was an Ottoman military detachment large enough to overpower a small escort. According to the Byzantine historian Ducas, the plan was to lure Vlad away from his court under the cover of diplomacy, seize him at the meeting site, and return with him in chains to Constantinople. From there, the Ottomans could install a compliant replacement without the expense of a full campaign. They already had one in mind. We will come back to him. Vlad understood what was happening almost immediately. How he understood it, the sources do not say. He may have had informants inside the delegation, or he may simply have recognized the arithmetic. A senior Ottoman governor did not personally cross an international frontier just to deliver an invitation. When Hamza Bey and his men entered Wallachian territory, they walked into an ambush. The Ottoman escort was surrounded and taken alive. Every one of them was executed by impalement. And here, for the first time in his reign against a foreign target, Vlad did something that would become his signature. He arranged the execution as a message. Hamza Bey, as the senior official, was placed on the highest stake. His rank was reflected in the manner of his death. Around and below him, arranged by descending status, were his officers, soldiers, and servants. The entire delegation became a diagram. Anyone who found the site, an Ottoman scout, a merchant, or an official receiving the report in Constantinople, would understand immediately what had happened and what Vlad thought of the man who had sent them. This was not simply an act of cruelty. It was the deliberate destruction of a legal category. Under the diplomatic conventions governing medieval Europe and the Islamic world, envoys were protected. Even during war, a ruler could send messengers to a rival court with a reasonable expectation that they would return alive. That protection allowed diplomacy to function. Vlad had taken that protection, killed it in public, and mounted it on a stake. For Mehmed, the failed ambush closed the door on every option that did not involve an army. You could not send another envoy to a man who impaled envoys. You could not begin negotiations with a prince who had just executed your regional governor. The next time Ottoman authority appeared on Wallachian soil, it would have to appear as a war. But Vlad was not going to wait for that war to reach him. During the deep winter of 1461 to 1462, while news of the executions was still reaching Constantinople, Vlad crossed the Danube. The river had frozen. It was an unusually cold winter, and for a few weeks, the natural moat protecting the Ottoman-held Bulgarian shore became a road. Vlad's cavalry, a mobile force built around a corps of loyal mercenaries, crossed the ice at night. What followed was closer to a special operation than a conventional medieval raid. Some of Vlad's men wore captured Ottoman uniforms and could briefly pass as returning garrison troops. They approached Bulgarian fortresses in small groups, sometimes carrying forged documents. They were admitted through the gates before anyone had time to check them carefully. Once inside, they opened the gates for the rest of the force. The garrisons were killed. The villages surrounding the fortresses were burned. The raid moved along hundreds of miles of the Ottoman-held Danube shore, from the region of modern Bulgaria eastward toward the Black Sea. We know the scale in unusually precise terms because Vlad himself wrote it down. In February of 1462, he sent a letter to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, his nominal ally, and in Vlad's mind, the future leader of a pan-European crusade against the Ottomans. The letter is one of the strangest surviving documents of the 15th century. It reads partly like a diplomatic report and partly like a resume. And it includes a body count. Vlad claimed that his forces had killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians during the winter campaign. That figure did not include, he specified, those who had been burned alive inside their homes and whose heads could not be delivered to his officials for counting. The number precise to 4 digits is one of the most notorious figures in medieval military correspondence. It was not presented as an estimate. Vlad's officers had been keeping count. The letter served 2 purposes. The first was strategic advertising. Matthias Corvinus was supposedly organizing a crusade against the Ottomans with money provided by the Pope. Vlad wanted the Hungarian court, the papacy, and every Christian ruler between Vienna and Rome to see Wallachia as the tip of the spear. If the crusade was coming, Vlad was ready. Send troops, send money. He would continue attacking Mehmed while the rest of Europe organized itself. The second purpose was less voluntary. Once the letter left Wallachia, Vlad could not take anything back. He had publicly claimed almost 24,000 Ottoman dead. He had insulted the Sultan personally, and he had done it in the name of a European crusade that, when he wrote the letter, still existed mostly on paper. By writing down what he had done, Vlad guaranteed that the largest army in Europe would come for him. And by presenting himself as the shield of Christendom, he made his survival dependent on a coalition that did not yet exist. In Constantinople, Mehmed's response was total. The Sultan had planned other campaigns that year. In his own mind, he was still pursuing a much larger project of expansion across the Balkans and the Mediterranean. Wallachia was supposed to be a secondary problem. After Vlad's winter raid, it became personal. Punishing the Wallachian prince now took priority, and Mehmed mobilized on a scale that surprised even his own court. Estimates of the Ottoman army assembled outside Constantinople in the spring of 1462 range from roughly 60 to 90,000 men. Historians still debate the exact figure, but the contemporary sources agree on the scale. It was the largest army Mehmed had put into the field since the siege of Constantinople itself. The Ottoman chronicler Chalkokondyles wrote that only Xerxes' invasion of Greece could rival it. That comparison says as much about how the Ottomans wanted the campaign remembered as it does about the actual number of troops. Against this force, Vlad could field no more than 30,000 men. Most were not professional soldiers. They were peasant militia conscripted for the campaign and armed largely with farming tools and short spears. The core of Vlad's army, the loyal cavalry that had crossed the frozen Danube, numbered only a few thousand. The rest of his force was, in straightforward military terms, a mob. The mathematics of a direct battle were suicidal. Everyone knew it. Vlad knew it too. So when the Ottoman army finally crossed the Danube in May and early June of 1462 and began marching toward the Wallachian capital of Târgoviște, it found something it had not prepared for. It found nothing. Vlad had already emptied the country. In the weeks before the invasion, his officers ordered the complete evacuation of the countryside along the Ottoman line of advance. Villages were abandoned. Peasants were driven into the Carpathian foothills with whatever grain and livestock they could carry. Everything left behind that might feed an invading army was destroyed. Crops were burned in the fields. Food stores were set alight. Livestock that could not be moved was killed. Wells were poisoned. According to the Ottoman chronicler Critoboulos, dead animals and diseased corpses were thrown into the water sources the invaders would need. Today, this is called scorched earth. The meaning has changed very little. You destroy the resources of your own country to deny them to a stronger enemy. You accept the ruin of your land as the price of survival. The tactic became central to later Wallachian wars against the Ottomans. Centuries later, the Russians would use variations of it against Napoleon. The Soviets would use it against the Wehrmacht. It is what a country does when the invader is stronger than its army, and the land itself is the last weapon it has left. The Ottomans had not prepared for it. 60,000 men, together with tens of thousands of horses and pack animals, required enormous quantities of food and water every day. Ottoman logistics assumed that an army operating in enemy territory could seize at least part of what it needed as it advanced. That assumption could mean the difference between a 2-month campaign and collapse within weeks. In Wallachia, during the summer of 1462, there was nothing left to seize. The Ottoman chronicles describe what happened next in nearly identical terms. Men began falling behind. Horses died first from dehydration exhaustion and contaminated water. Within days of crossing the Danube, the pack train began to break down. Then dysentery spread through the ranks. Then typhus. By some estimates, the Ottoman army was losing more men each week to disease and thirst than many medieval armies lost in an entire battle. And it had not yet seen a single Wallachian soldier. It is worth pausing here to address a myth that has followed this campaign for 500 years. The popular version is that Vlad won the war in a great battle. Somewhere in Wallachia, a small Christian force supposedly faced a Muslim horde and defeated it through courage and tactical brilliance. That is not what happened. Vlad never accepted a field battle. He did not have the army for one, and he knew it. What he did instead was harder to describe, and in the long run more influential. He turned his own country into a weapon. The historian Matej Kazaku, author of the standard modern biography of Vlad, has argued that the campaign should be understood as one of the earliest fully documented examples of asymmetric warfare in European history. Vlad's genius was not strategy in the classical sense, moving armies holding territory, or choosing the ground for battle. It was psychology. Everything he did during the summer of 1462 was designed to attack not the Ottoman army's body, but its mind. The thirst disease and emptiness were only the preparation. What came next was the strike. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad launched the sharpest attack of the campaign. The Ottoman army had advanced deep into Wallachia. Its logistics were failing. Its men were sick, thirsty, and exhausted. The army camped somewhere southwest of Târgoviște. The exact location remains debated. The camp itself was enormous, stretching across several miles of open ground. At its center stood the Sultan's tent. Beside it was the pavilion of Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha. Vlad assembled somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 cavalry. The exact number varies between sources, but even Ottoman chronicles that minimize the damage agree on the basic outline. Around midnight, the Wallachian force approached under cover of darkness. They lit torches. They sounded Ottoman-style bugles. Then they charged. The bugles were the key. Ottoman battlefield communication relied on horn signals. Different calls conveyed different orders. As the Wallachian cavalry tore through the outer edge of the camp, they sounded commands that Ottoman troops had been trained their entire lives to obey. In the darkness, no one could see who was issuing the signals. Units began attacking one another. Reinforcements rushed toward the wrong sections of the camp. Panic spread among sleeping soldiers before anyone understood what was happening. Vlad's objective was not the camp. It was the Sultan's tent. The attack was aimed directly at Mehmed. According to the Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg, our best source from the Sultan's side, the plan was to cut a path through the camp, reach Mehmed, and kill him. Not defeat him. Kill him personally. They did not reach him. The sources disagree about why. Some accounts say Vlad's cavalry attacked the wrong pavilion, striking Mahmud Pasha's tent by mistake in the confusion. Others say the Sultan's personal guard, the elite Janissaries, formed such a dense defense around the center of the camp that no cavalry charge could break through. But the result is clear. When dawn arrived and the chaos of friendly fire finally ended, Mehmed was still alive. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were dead, and Vlad's cavalry had withdrawn into the countryside with most of its force intact. The casualty figures from the night attack remain one of the unresolved disputes of medieval military history. Ottoman chroniclers minimized the losses to protect the Sultan's prestige. Wallachian and Hungarian accounts exaggerated them, sometimes wildly, to present the attack as a Christian miracle. But the psychological effect is not in dispute. The Ottoman army had just been shown that Vlad could reach the Sultan's tent in the darkness. Mehmed had survived, but something less tangible had died. What vanished that night was the sense of safety at the center of the Ottoman camp, the psychological foundation of every large medieval army. If the Sultan himself could be killed in his tent, then no soldier was safe anywhere. Ottoman morale, already weakened by thirst disease and exhaustion, began to crack in a way that no formal battlefield defeat could have achieved. And Mehmed still had tens of thousands of men. By late June, the sick, exhausted, and shaken Ottoman army was approaching the outskirts of Târgoviște. The capital was the political prize. Taking it was the only outcome that could still justify the campaign. Mehmed had come too far to stop before reaching its walls. What was waiting for him outside those walls would end the war. Late June, 1462. The Ottoman army, sick, thirsty, exhausted, and torn open from within by the night raid, finally came within sight of Târgoviște. The capital was less impressive than they had expected. Târgoviște in 1462 was a modest fortified town of brick and wood surrounded by ordinary walls. Nothing on the scale of Constantinople or Adrianople. If the campaign had gone according to plan, a rapid advance, intact logistics, and an army still at full strength, the siege of Târgoviște would have taken weeks, not months. But the campaign had not gone according to plan. Before the army reached the walls, the road opened into a wide, flat valley. That was where they found the field. The valley stretched roughly 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. Across it, arranged in tight, deliberately spaced rows, stood approximately 20,000 wooden stakes. On every stake was a corpse. Some were fresh, most were not. According to Chalcocondyles, our main source for what the Ottoman advance guard saw, the field had been standing for some time. The bodies were in different stages of decomposition. Crows and larger scavengers nested inside the rib cages. In the summer heat, the smell reached the front of the column before the sight did. The victims were not, as the later myth would suggest, Ottoman soldiers killed in a single massacre. That is the first thing the historical record makes clear, and the first thing separating what happened from what people later imagined. Most of the impaled were prisoners taken during Vlad's winter campaign along the Danube. Ottoman garrison troops, Bulgarian collaborators who had cooperated with Ottoman rule, and Wallachians whom Vlad had judged to be internal traitors. They had been executed in Wallachia weeks or months earlier, then transported to this valley and arranged as a display. This was not the debris of a battle. It was a stage set. The historian Matei Kazaku has argued that the forest of the impaled should be understood as one of the most precisely engineered psychological attacks in medieval warfare. Every element was calibrated against the specific enemy who would see it. Ottoman military culture in the 15th century was deeply shaped by Islamic religious practice. Islamic tradition requires the dead to be washed, wrapped, and buried facing Mecca as soon as possible, ideally within a day. The proper burial of a soldier was not merely a preference, it was a religious obligation, and denying it carried specific spiritual consequences. Vlad had denied it to 20,000 men. Every stake in that field violated an obligation the Ottoman soldiers had been raised to consider sacred. The bodies had not been washed. They had not been buried. They had been left in the open, exposed to animals, and displayed before the entire army. To the Ottoman troops, this was not simply cruelty. It was a specific religious atrocity aimed at a specific religious sensibility, designed by a man who had grown up inside their court and knew exactly what he was doing. That precision is what separated the display from ordinary battlefield brutality. Vlad had not lost his temper. He had not acted in the heat of the moment months earlier. He had calculated what would inflict the greatest spiritual and psychological damage on the army that would march through this valley in the summer of 1462. Then he prepared it. When Mehmed reached the valley, and every Ottoman chronicler agrees that he rode forward to see it, his reaction was recorded by both sides. Chalcocondyles, in a passage repeatedly quoted and translated across 5 centuries, has the Sultan expressing roughly the same judgment he could not in good conscience take the country of a man capable of governing his people through such acts. Whether this was awe-revulsion or a diplomatic way of admitting that his exhausted army had reached its psychological limit is unclear. It was probably all three. What is not disputed is what he did next. Mehmed ordered the army to turn around. The Ottoman force did not sack Târgoviște. It did not besiege the city. It did not pursue Vlad's troops into the surrounding hills. The army withdrew toward the Danube in reasonable order under the circumstances. It burned what it could along the way and endured intermittent attacks from Wallachian light cavalry. But it was, in every meaningful sense, a beaten army by any conventional measure of medieval warfare. This was a complete victory for Vlad. He had faced the largest army in Europe, commanded by its most feared ruler, and forced it to retreat without accepting a pitched battle. The prince, who had been outnumbered 3-1, had defeated the conqueror of Constantinople. He had also, at that exact moment, lost the war. Mehmed did not leave Wallachia empty-handed. Before withdrawing across the Danube, he left behind a small Ottoman contingent commanded by Vlad's younger brother, Radu. The boy who had adapted to the Ottoman court, converted to Islam, and grown up close to the future sultan. Radu was, in a very literal sense, Vlad's ideological opposite. He had not merely survived the Ottoman court, he had absorbed it, and he possessed one advantage over his brother that no Wallachian prince had ever had. He offered the exhausted Wallachian nobility a way out, the boyars, the same aristocratic class Vlad had spent his reign terrorizing into obedience, had just endured an Ottoman invasion that devastated half the country's farmland. Their estates were burned. Their peasants were scattered through the mountains. Vlad's scorched earth defense had saved the country, but it had ruined the class that administered it. Now, with the Ottoman army gone, Radu appeared with a different offer: peace, trade. The restoration of the old boyar privileges Vlad had stripped away. Ottoman gold to rebuild their estates. Wallachia could retain its autonomy as long as it paid tribute and remained loyal to Constantinople. For a Wallachian noble in the summer of 1462, his farmland reduced to ash, his harvest destroyed, and his prince responsible for impaling his relatives, the choice was not difficult. Over the following months, Radu quietly built support across Wallachia. Boyars who had spent Vlad's reign in exile began returning. Local militias changed allegiance. Vlad's scorched earth strategy had been brilliant against a foreign invader, but it left him with nothing to offer the men who had followed him. He was effectively running out of country. By November of 1462, with his forces disappearing and no foreign assistance coming, Vlad made the decision that ended his reign. He crossed the Carpathians into Transylvania to ask King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, his nominal ally, and the man the papacy had funded to lead a crusade for military support. He did not receive support. He was arrested. The reason takes some untangling, and it reveals one of the bitterest ironies in Vlad's story. In 1460 and 1461, the papacy had transferred a large sum of money to the Hungarian crown, specifically to fund a pan-European crusade against the Ottomans. Matthias had accepted the money. He had not organized the crusade. By late 1462, he needed to explain to Rome why the funds had not produced an army. Vlad arrived asking for help. Instead, he became Matthias's explanation. The Hungarian court produced a collection of letters supposedly showing that Vlad had been secretly negotiating with the Sultan. Modern historians widely regard the letters as forgeries. Vlad was arrested for treason. The accusation allowed Matthias to justify keeping the papal money. Vlad was placed in Hungarian custody, where he would remain on and off for the next 12 years. Wallachia passed to Radu, and through Radu, effectively returned to Ottoman control. The war Vlad had won at Târgoviște ended with a quiet arrest hundreds of miles away, carried out by an ally. The historian Kurt Treptow, whose modern study of Vlad remains one of the most careful reconstructions of the campaign, argues that the war Vlad won and the war he lost were two different wars. Militarily, against the Ottomans, he carried out one of the most sophisticated asymmetric campaigns of the medieval period. Politically, against everyone else he failed. Wallachia was too small to sustain a prolonged war. Its economy could not recover from scorched earth as quickly as Ottoman gold could rebuild the boyar estates. And Vlad had created too many enemies inside his own country to survive the peace. The lesson, if there is one, is uncomfortable. Vlad's terror worked on the battlefield. Fear applied with enough discipline and precision could turn back an imperial army. But fear could not build a coalition. It could not finance a war. It could not keep the nobility loyal once the harvest was gone. The same weapon that saved Wallachia in June destroyed the political foundation meant to hold it together in November. There is one more twist in this story. It shaped Vlad's memory more than anything else. At almost the exact moment Vlad was fighting Mehmed along the Danube, a new technology was being commercialized several hundred miles to the west, in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. The movable type printing press. By the 1470s and 1480s, while Vlad remained in Hungarian captivity, German-language pamphlets about him had become some of the most widely printed political documents in Europe. The pamphlets were propaganda. Many were produced by political enemies who had their own reasons for portraying Vlad, and by extension, his Hungarian patron, as a monster. They took the real, documented brutality of his reign and multiplied it. They invented scenes of Vlad calmly eating among impaled prisoners. They added the claim, apparently first published in a Nuremberg pamphlet during the 1480s, that he dipped his bread in the blood of his victims. Contemporary accounts of the 1462 campaign do not describe Vlad drinking blood or dining among corpses. The later pamphlets do. And the pamphlets were the version that survived. 4 centuries later, in the 1890s, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker was searching for a name for a Gothic villain. He had been reading about the region. He found the name Dracula, derived from Dracul, the name Vlad's father had adopted as a member of the medieval Order of the Dragon. Stoker liked it. He borrowed it. The character attached to that name had almost nothing to do with the 15th century Wallachian prince. Stoker's Dracula was a supernatural aristocrat with fangs, an aversion to sunlight, and an appetite for young English women. He was not a warlord. He was not a defender of Christendom. He was a Victorian Gothic invention whose only connection to the historical Vlad was a borrowed name and a vague association with cruelty. But the name endured. In the 20th century, film added the cape, the accent, and the ritual. By the time modern audiences encountered Dracula, the historical figure beneath the fiction was almost impossible to see. The vampire had eaten the warlord. That is the deeper irony of Vlad's story. The exact weapon that saved Wallachia in the summer of 1462, the theatrical, calculated, precisely engineered display of atrocity, was also the weapon that destroyed his historical legacy. The forest of the Impaled worked. It broke an Ottoman army, but it also created the imagery that transformed him over the following centuries into a fictional monster whose real historical actions almost no one remembered. So, it is worth returning to the moment where this story began. Spring 1462. 60,000 men march out of Constantinople under the most feared commander in Europe. By late June, that same commander stands at the edge of a valley in Wallachia, looking at 20,000 corpses mounted on wooden stakes. Then he gives the order to turn around. He was not defeated by an army. There was no battle worth remembering. The prince opposing him did not have the numbers. He did not have the training. He did not have the artillery. What Vlad possessed was a specific understanding, developed during 6 years as an Ottoman hostage, of exactly what the soldiers in that army would find intolerable. And he had the ruthlessness to construct it at an industrial scale directly across their line of march. That was the 15th century answer to the question with which we began. How does a weak state stop a superpower? Vlad's answer was that you cannot beat it. You can only make it no longer want to be there. The Ottomans no longer wanted to be there. They went home. Vlad, in the end, did not keep his country. His ally betrayed him. His nobility abandoned him. His methods succeeded in war and failed in peace. 5 centuries of storytelling turned him into a vampire, and almost none of it is remembered accurately. But for a few weeks in the summer of 1462, in a wide valley outside Târgoviște, a minor Wallachian prince accomplished what everyone believed was impossible. He looked at the largest army in Europe and made it blink.